In a world where silence is often regarded as a protective shield, the death of Yu Menglong poses a question that is not easy to answer. Was it merely the end of a life, or was it the final pawn swept off a power chessboard that the public is never permitted to see in its entirety? When a human being who was once vividly present before the camera suddenly becomes an information void, the unease does not stop at personal loss. It spreads into a sense of societal concern. 100 days have passed since Yu Menglong departed from this world. Measured by the scale of history, 100 days is not a long duration. However, for those still attempting to understand what truly happened, it is a prolonged, heavy, and persistent silence. Death in itself is not unfamiliar to humanity. What prevents the public from finding peace is that this departure is shrouded in a mist of information, where fundamental questions have yet to find satisfactory answers. There are those who admit that they previously lived in a state of indifference. The fast pace of life, the dense flow of news, and the continuous whirlpools of entertainment taught people to skim through everything without pausing for too long. Nevertheless, the story of Yu Menglong has become a moment of awakening. It has forced many to slow down, to look directly into the shadows that exist parallel to the aura of fame, shadows that have long been ignored. When a story is not clarified, silence is no longer neutral. It gradually becomes a psychological burden hanging over the entire society. In the days that followed, an image of powerful symbolic significance circulated across the digital space, countless hands together supporting a small creature, pushing it forward. Some were once skeptical that even if millions of small individuals united, they could not create any shift against massive power structures. However, that very image poses another question. Is the value of an individual measured by solitary strength, or by the ability to raise a collective voice when facing injustice? The concern for Yu Menglong does not stem solely from affection for a celebrity. Hidden behind it is a deeper, universal anxiety. If today, a story can be closed with information that is insufficient to be persuasive, then what will happen when similar situations befall ordinary people who have no stage lights and no public attention? From this point, the story begins to transcend the scope of a personal incident. It becomes a mirror reflecting society's silent anxieties regarding transparency, accountability, and the fragile boundary between power and truth. This is the reason why, despite the passage of time, the questions surrounding the name Yu Menglong have not subsided. Before becoming the focal point of prolonged debates, Yu Menglong existed in the public consciousness as a relatively quiet face within the Chinese entertainment industry. His career path was not associated with loud controversies or provocative statements. The familiar image that audiences remember is an actor who worked steadily, appeared just enough, and rarely took the initiative to place himself at the center of the media. In an environment that prioritizes attention and the ability to stir public opinion, that reticence seemed like a safe choice, even regarded as a manifestation of professionalism. However, that very quietness, when placed within the broader context of the mainland entertainment industry, suggests many layers of meaning. The entertainment world here has long been more than just a space for artistic creativity. It is a complex ecosystem where power, economic interests, and public image are tightly intertwined. For those operating within this system, pressure comes not only from audiences or revenue, but also from unspoken rules that are not recorded in writing but still possess a powerful influence over personal choices. In such a context, silence is often viewed as a survival strategy. Limiting statements, avoiding the disclosure of personal opinions, or staying away from public debates can help an individual maintain a stable position within the general operational machinery. Yet prolonged silence also has its downside. When a personal voice is suppressed for a long time, psychological pressure can accumulate silently, unrecognizable from the outside. This is something the public only began to reflect upon after the story of Yu Menglong occurred. According to information recounted in later discussions, Yu Menglong once entered a phase of his career marked by many changes. On the surface, these might have been familiar issues of the acting profession, such as roles, contracts, or image orientation. However, behind these seemingly purely professional decisions was an environment where the boundary between personal freedom and systemic compliance was not always clear. It is at this intersection that many questions regarding motives began to form in the mind of the public. Public motives, when viewed from the outside, are often explained by familiar concepts: protecting a career, maintaining an image, or fulfilling contractual obligations. These are reasonable and common factors in any entertainment industry. However, parallel to these, there always exist hidden motives that are difficult to observe and even harder to prove. These could be prolonged psychological pressure, the fear of being isolated within a closed system, or a sense of losing control over one's own life. These factors are rarely expressed directly, yet they possess a profound impact on an individual's mental state. When the incident occurred, the initial information was announced quickly, closing the case with a brief conclusion. In terms of form, this was a familiar procedure, no different from many other cases. However, that very brevity left noticeable gaps. Fundamental questions about the circumstances, the progression, and the sequence of related events were not clarified in detail. This does not automatically imply the existence of wrongdoing, but in a society accustomed to strict information control, a lack of transparency quickly becomes a catalyst for suspicion. From that moment, the public began to turn back time, searching for previous signs in the statements, images, and products that Yu Menglong had left behind. Certain details that previously attracted little attention were now placed in an entirely different context. This process reflects not only the desire to seek the truth about an individual, but also shows a collective psychology attempting to piece together fragmented information to fill an unfinished story. These information gaps, therefore, became the center of discussions. At a deeper level, the story of Yu Menglong touches upon a core issue: what truly governs the behavior and choices of those operating in a system where power and information are not distributed equally. When an event occurs in such a context, the reaction of society can hardly stop at merely accepting an official announcement. The need to ask questions becomes a natural reflex, especially for those who have witnessed similar cases in the past. It must be emphasized that this skepticism does not necessarily stem from a desire to deny all announced information. Instead, it reflects a collective psychological state where trust has been eroded over time. In those circumstances, every information gap is easily interpreted in many different directions. It is from this foundation that the story of Yu Menglong began to move beyond the scope of a personal incident, becoming a convergence point for silent anxieties about transparency, accountability, and society's right to know. This served as the premise for the wave of reactions in the following days to surge powerfully, pushing the story into a new phase where the media and the public were swept into a flood of information at a speed difficult to control. When the information gaps were not yet filled, the story of Yu Menglong quickly departed from the scope of a personal incident and became the center of a media flood. In a short time, the digital space moved with an intense speed, where every new piece of information, no matter how small, had the potential to stir collective emotions. Platforms usually familiar with entertainment topics were now flooded with societal questions reflecting a clear shift in public concern. The initial reaction bore the heavy mark of mourning. People shared old photos, recalled roles that left an impression, and spoke of a sense of loss that was difficult to name. However, that flow of emotion quickly blended with suspicion. When official information was announced without accompanying detailed explanations sufficient to answer fundamental questions, the public began to form their own process of searching for answers. At this point, social media no longer played only a reflective role but became a space for restructuring the narrative. Symbolic actions appeared in increasing numbers. From online memorial campaigns and calls for signatures to placing images and messages related to the case in public spaces overseas. It is noteworthy that the scope of these activities was not limited by national borders. Concern spread to many different communities, including those who previously had no direct connection to the Chinese entertainment industry. This shows that the story touched upon more universal concerns, transcending the identity of a specific individual. Parallel to that spread was an increasingly clear process of public polarization. One segment of the public chose to trust the announced information, arguing that continuing to dig deeper only increased unnecessary tension and speculation. For them, social order is maintained through accepting official conclusions, even when not every detail is made public. This perspective stems from a desire for stability and the avoidance of conflict, in a context where too many controversial stories have previously left society in a state of fatigue. Conversely, another group argued that the very absence of full information was the reason suspicion spread. For them, asking questions does not equate to denial, but is the minimum requirement to protect public trust. They argued that, in a modern society, transparency is not just an option, but a necessary condition for maintaining social consensus. Silence, in this case, was viewed as a sign of a problem rather than a solution. These two streams of perspective existed in parallel and sometimes confronted each other directly in prolonged debates. These exchanges did not only revolve around the story of Yu Menglong, but also expanded into how society reacts to authoritative announcements. Social media, in that context, was both a tool for connection and a space for amplifying conflict. Every post, every video, and every comment could be interpreted in many different ways, depending on the position and experience of the recipient. Another factor contributing to the intensity of the media flood was the participation of influential individuals. When commentators, scholars, or social activists spoke up, the story was placed in a broader frame of reference. Some approached the issue from the perspective of social ethics, while others analyzed it as a classic example of a communication crisis in an environment of information control. Although perspectives differed, the commonality was that this event became a catalyst for a discussion that went far beyond the scope of entertainment. The impact of the media flood did not stop at public opinion. It also influenced how the public perceived the entire cultural and entertainment ecosystem. Questions about power, about the safety of individuals within the system, and about the boundary between private life and collective interest were repeated with increasing frequency. This concern reflects a societal state where trust is no longer a given but needs to be reinforced by clear and consistent information. Amidst that context, emotion played a powerful role in governing how people received information. There were times when indignation overwhelmed reason, causing unverified hypotheses to spread rapidly. Simultaneously, efforts calling for restraint appeared, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between facts and speculation. This tug-of-war created a tense atmosphere where each side believed they were protecting a core value, even though that value was understood in different ways. It was during this phase that the story posed a question not easy to answer. When information is incomplete, to whom does the responsibility of seeking the truth belong, and what are the limits of skepticism? This was no longer an issue unique to one incident, but a collective challenge for society in the digital media era, where the speed of spread often exceeds the capacity for verification. Faced with an increasingly clear divide, many people began to question their own position within that flow. Some chose silence, some continued to speak out, and some changed their views when approaching new perspectives. The diversity in reactions showed that the media flood was not just a surface phenomenon, but an expression of deep contradictions in how society handles issues related to power and trust. It was from that polarization, debate, and suspicion that the story of Yu Menglong gradually advanced toward its darkest phase, where unanswered questions no longer just caused bewilderment, but began to directly impact society's perception of its own future and safety. As the wave of discussion expanded and viewpoints were clearly exposed, the story of Yu Menglong entered its darkest phase. This was no longer a time for spontaneous reactions or momentary emotions. The absence of information, prolonged over time, began to create a smoldering state of tension where society's sense of security was gradually eroded. Unanswered questions were no longer on the periphery, they became the center of collective concern. At this stage, public opinion no longer focused on individual details but directed attention to the overall picture. Signs that were once considered scattered were placed together, not to affirm a specific scenario, but to point out the information gaps that still persisted. These information gaps, though they could not yet be filled with verified facts, carried significant psychological weight. They caused the public not only to wonder what had happened, but also to raise issues about how similar incidents might be handled in the future. A sense of helplessness appeared clearly in many exchanges. There were those who admitted they did not expect new information soon, yet still could not accept that silence was regarded as a final conclusion. In that context, skepticism gradually shifted from a state of antagonism to a form of mental self-defense. When unable to access the full truth, humans seek to protect themselves by asking questions, even knowing that those questions might never receive a clear answer. The climax of this dark phase lay in the story transcending the scope of a specific individual. Many began to compare the case of Yu Menglong with other events that had occurred in the past, where official announcements were issued quickly but were not accompanied by a detailed explanatory process. The repetition of that pattern, even in different contexts, caused the sense of unease to gradually become a familiar state. When the abnormal is repeated enough times, society faces the risk of accepting it as an inevitable part of life. However, precisely at this dark point, a subtle transformation began to take shape. Instead of only revolving around suspicions regarding an individual, the discussion gradually shifted toward the question of collective responsibility. If a story that has not been clarified can cause such a widespread and prolonged effect, then what does that say about the relationship between citizens, the media, and power? This question does not aim to find a specific object to blame, but to clarify the role of each component in maintaining social trust. The moment regarded as an epiphany did not come from new information or a decisive piece of evidence. It came from the realization that regardless of the outcome of the case, its impact has gone far beyond its original scope. Yu Menglong was no longer mentioned only as an actor or a central figure of debate. He became an unintended symbol for the anxiety over the fragility of the individual before larger structures, where a human voice can easily be drowned out without public attention. From this perspective, many began to look back at their own roles. Not everyone has the ability to create enough pressure to promote transparency. But the choice not to turn away, not to hastily forget, was seen as a form of silent participation. In a society where information can be limited, collective memory becomes a different form of archive, one that is harder to control and harder to erase. That epiphany carried an important realization. This story does not only belong to the past, it poses a question for the future. If today an incident can leave behind so many gaps, then what will guarantee that similar stories in the future will be handled differently? That question has no simple answer, but the very fact that it was posed showed a change in how society perceives the right to know and the right to ask. When the darkness of contracts, invisible pressure, and prolonged silence enveloped the name Yu Menglong, what remained was not a final verdict, but a painful resonance in the minds of those left behind. He has become an unintended symbol, a silent but persistent reminder of the fragility of the individual when standing before power structures that the public rarely has the opportunity to see in their entirety. This story does not only belong to one profession or a specific system. It reflects a broader lesson about social trust. When transparency is replaced by vague information gaps, trust does not disappear immediately, but it is eroded bit by suspicion and a sense of unease. In an era where the boundary between facts and speculation is increasingly fragile, the responsibility of society is not just to receive information, but to maintain the capacity to distinguish and to ask questions soberly. It is possible that the final pieces of the Yu Menglong story will never be fully made public, but the impact the incident has left behind is undeniable. It has forced society to look directly into the most sensitive shadows, where power, information, and individual fate intersect. Asking questions in this context is not an act of antagonism, but a manifestation of civic responsibility and respect for human dignity. The future remains open. The truth, if it arrives, may arrive very late or not in the way the public expects. But the journey to seek it sometimes begins with a simpler thing: the refusal to forget. When collective memory is maintained, unfinished stories are not easily buried in silence. Ultimately, the story of Yu Menglong leaves each person with a choice that is personal, yet carries profound social significance. Between the temporary peace of silence and the unease that comes with asking questions, where will each person stand? And it is from that choice that the way society faces similar stories in the future will gradually be shaped.